Thank you all for being here. My name is Oliver. I'm one of the co-founders of Nucleate and currently serve as our executive director. And it's my pleasure to be holding our first info session for the Lilly Grand Challenge 2026 on the theme of aging reimagined. We do have on the call with us Agata from Ovo Labs, who was one of the winners or the winner of last year's challenge. And in a couple of minutes, you'll be able to hear directly from her about her science, her experience at the challenge, and get your questions answered. In the meantime, I'm going to very quickly share my screen and just go over a couple of items related to what the challenge is. So as I mentioned, this year's Grand Challenge is on the theme of Aging Reimagined, New Health Frontiers, with several different subtracks that I will go into a little bit later. Applications are currently open from now through May 15th, so make sure that you don't miss that deadline. So just a little bit about Nucleate. Here at Nucleate, we have a thesis that education, not capital, is actually the earliest bottleneck for biotech innovation. When you think about it, right, academic ideas, breakthrough ideas are originating in academic environments, but most scientific talent is not exposed to pathways beyond the lab. As a result, early career scientists lack access to the education, mentorship, and community that they need to translate their ideas into real world impact. Nucleate was created to be the missing development layer between academic discovery and real world impact. And we operate as a global talent development and translational platform, really helping support paths in the industry from scientific curiosity all the way to company formation at a global scale. We have this incredible network of chapters, researchers, founders, and industry mentors, as well as corporate partners and sponsors. Our main program, the Activator, is our innovation engine. And this is the program that we use to help people start companies from their academic research without taking equity or charging any fees. We also run a variety of other programs, such as webinars, workshops, and fellowships under what we call PATH, which is our professional advancement and training hub, where we help people take that next catalytic step into their chosen career path out of academia. We also run a lot of events and have a great social media presence. So definitely, follow up, share, excuse me, check out our LinkedIn, check out our newsletter, and, check out our events calendar if you'd like to attend an upcoming event near you. What is the Grand Challenge? So the Grand Challenge is a 2-day event at Lilly HQ in Indianapolis, where about 10 teams will have the chance to connect with senior leadership at Lilly and present their science, all expenses covered. Lilly will award one team $100,000 in non-dilutive funding to support their technology developments with no strings or conditions attached. Select teams will also gain access to Lilly's network of scientific and business expertise. Who is eligible and how do you apply? So any technology at any stage with an application to aging and health span aligned with our 4 tracks are eligible to apply. This includes people working very early stage and still as an academic project in this sort of in vitro proof of concept stage, all the way through clinical stage companies. The 4 tracks this year are mobility and frailty, cognitive and sensory health, immune resilience, and regenerative medicine, which is a bit of our wild card track for this year. The application is very simple, very similar to our Activator application, and you can feel free to reuse your program materials if you've previously submitted to the Activator. We do not require affiliation with Nucleate to apply, so anyone can apply, and international applicants are welcome. So please do tell your friends, reshare this among your network. It's a fantastic opportunity for early stage innovators working in this space. Teams that have a healthcare provider on their team, like if your team includes like an MD or equivalent, you're welcome to apply. But unfortunately, because of the compliance restrictions, Lilly cannot pay for healthcare providers to actually come and attend the event. So you need to send a different designation of someone else in your team. You can be an incorporated company or you can be a research project, although Lilly is looking for projects that are translational and likely to result in the formation of an entity or a licensing or strategic collaboration. The event will take place in Lilly headquarters from September 21st to September 22nd. We will cover all the travel expenses for one member of your team to come. And the agenda will include some fun activities as well as networking with Lilly scientists and senior leadership, a postering session, and a final pitch competition where you will compete for the $100,000 grand prize. Just a highlight of last year's challenge, which was on the track of women's health and genetic medicine. This is a very, very competitive challenge. Every year we see hundreds of applications, but only a certain number of finalists are able to come. We see representation from many, hundreds of different academic institutions, and many folks, increasingly so, who apply are not actually affiliated with Nucleate, which again is not a requirement. Anyone can apply from any geography, working on any stage of research, as long as it fits within those 4 sub-tracks and the overall theme. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and also make sure that I spotlight The appropriate people. Perfect. Awesome. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Agata, who's the CEO and co-founder of Ovo Labs, and was the winner of the 2025 Grand Challenge. So maybe first you could just tell everyone a little bit about who you are and what you do at Ovo Labs.
Absolutely. So, as Oliver has already mentioned, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Ovo Labs. And at Ovo Labs, what we do is we are developing biologics to improve the quality of human eggs so that everyone who wants to become a parent has a realistic chance of doing so. And what really lies at the heart of what we're doing is tackling age-related female infertility. What you may be aware of is that women are born with all the eggs they will ever have, which really creates this very big problem because that means that at the time of trying to conceive, at the time of fertilization, you're really relying on a single cell that is multiple decades old. And what I've been doing now for a number of years is really trying to understand how the quality of the human egg deteriorates with age. And what is really very unique about the approach that we took back in 2012, 2013 is to be actually directly looking at human eggs from patients. So in the past, people largely use model organisms, but we said, no, this isn't good enough. And we established collaboration with Bornhall, which is the world's first IVF clinic. And together with now my co-founder, Professor Melina Schuh, but back then my PhD supervisor, we've uncovered some of the key mechanisms that underlie this age-related equality decline and fertility decline. And now at Ovo Labs, we are developing therapeutics. So these are biologics that are delivered directly into human eggs to improve their quality. And what really makes our approach so special is that unlike most therapeutics, our patient is a single cell in vitro because we deliver the therapeutics directly during the IVF process. And I suppose the other thing that makes it so special and so unique is that this would be really a first in class approach because there is currently nothing on the market that can improve the quality of human eggs and really drastically improve your likelihood of conceiving when you're older.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for that overview. And can you talk a little bit maybe about sort of your academic path, to this startup? How did you join the lab? What were the basic science questions that you guys were really interested in working on? And how did that lead to where you are now, where you're commercializing a therapy for patients?
Well, in my case, the reason why I decided to address this problem was not commercial at all, and it was just largely driven by this huge curiosity of how life begins and what is happening before an embryo becomes big enough to implant into the uterus. And I've always been in that field. I've been extremely passionate about this topic. And the reason why I decided to join Melina, so my now co-founder for the PhD back in 2013, was because she was the only person who then told me, well, instead of just working on animal models, you can actually address this question directly in patient samples. And really, during many years of work, we've been really trying to understand why equality declines. And of course, we always had this translational angle, thinking about this, how can this then in the future help to benefit people? But because the understanding of the human egg was so rudimentary, we really had to start from basics and apply molecular techniques, advanced microscopy techniques to really understand how chromosome segregation happens in the context of female meiosis in humans and why it so frequently goes wrong. Now, to answer the second part of the question, how did we then decide to co-found Ovo Labs? So over time, the technology was becoming more and more advanced and really came to this stage that what we had was sufficiently diversified and tested directly in patient samples to an extent that we felt that we are really not just a single modality company, but we have we're still an asset company, but at least a whole class of assets that can act as independent entities. And at that stage, we felt it's time to transition. But again, what made our approach quite similar to, I guess, what many of you have done is that we really come from basic science, from people who spend most of their time in the lab and haven't really have thought of founding a company 5 years ago or so.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And could you talk a little bit about like how you first heard about the Grand Challenge, and maybe what were some of your initial questions or things that you were curious about? Many of the people on this call may be in a similar position to you, last year when you were first hearing about the challenge.
I have to say that you're very much ahead of me because I found out about the challenge only 48 hours or maybe even less than that before the application deadline. So at that time, what we did at Ovo Labs is we applied for CDL, which is another mentorship program called Creative Distraction Lab. And one of the mentors got an email from Nucleate, and then she felt like, oh, I know this company Ovo Labs. Let me forward them the application. And yeah, so it was all quite short notice, but I have to say that the application form was very straightforward, and the kind of questions that are asked are anyway the things that you're thinking about very actively. So in our case, I believe I've written this application the same evening, then I just shared it with my co-founders. We still like discussed and fine-tuned it, but it was really a very quick effort. And yeah, I was extremely fortunate to have been in this position to accidentally have found out about this opportunity.
Also, that's funny. I didn't actually know that story. That's great. Um, Maybe you can talk a little bit about what the process was like, from the time that you applied to getting interviewed, and then, what it was like to attend the challenge and a little bit about the event itself.
I would say that the process was really straightforward. So soon after the application deadline, we've then received an invitation for an interview, which was very science heavy. So at that point, I have to say I wasn't quite sure what to expect. And later on, when we found out that we've been selected for the challenge, then the next two things that we had to do was to prepare a poster. And this was, again, I would say relatively short notice, but at the same time, you have done similar things before. So it was all very much feasible, and also prepare the presentation. Now, when it comes to the challenge itself, it has this 2 day format. And I would say that the way you can benefit from those 2 days is very different. So the first day, from what I remember, was more about learning more about Eli Lilly and getting to know people in a more informal way. And this, I have to say, I personally found very fascinating because, we all know of drugs like fluoxetine, Humulin I, but actually to be in the place where it also has been developed, it was by far one of the highlights of last year for me, and something that I will certainly remember about for a long period of time. And then what was also very nice is we had this informal networking session. And during this time, you really had a chance to meet other candidates and actually speak with them in a lot of depth about what science they're doing, what kind of challenges they've encountered, which was really great. And I believe we also had a dinner with the Nucleate team members, and there Oliver and the team were very helpful to essentially tell us more about the Lilly people who are coming to the event and in what kind of ways we should interact with them, what is their expertise, which really then meant that on the day you knew exactly who to look out for. And then the second day was the more formal part of the experience. The most important part by far was the poster session, where you really had multiple people from Lilly coming and discussing your science and your approach with you. And then the three companies who were selected had then an opportunity to present actually on stage, so to give a talk. But this was all happening very rapidly. Yeah, and then the winner was selected.
Awesome. And we do get this question a lot in terms of the mechanics of how the event works. So I'll maybe just preface it here. So can you talk a little bit about, the poster session happens and then there's like a bit of a down selection, right? And there's some
Mhm.
judges and then only a certain number of people sort of take the stage. Like how do you go from, can you just walk through the pipeline of what happened on that day from you starting with the poster to actually being awarded the prize?
Absolutely. So during the poster session, you have many people coming to your poster. Not everyone is an evaluator, but you can, in a way, tell the evaluators apart because they have little pieces of paper on which they do the scoring. But at the same time, sometimes it feels as though if you're maybe in a very in-depth discussion with someone else and the evaluator is just on the side listening in. And this process actually took some time. So I remember I had a chance to speak to a huge number of people from different backgrounds. And what was very nice is, of course, these are individuals who have a lot of experience in drug development, but at the same time, they often come from a different field. So at least when it comes to fertility, it's not that Lilly has an active R&D department focusing on this topic. So many of the people that I've spoken in had a huge experience in immunology, neuroscience, and so on. But nevertheless, the kind of questions they were asking were very often spot on and in some ways quite dangerous, how they could really unpick some of the potential difficulties, regulatory challenges, and so on. And afterwards, the three people selected for the pitch were announced. And then it was actually a very quick process. So I believe it was probably less than 30 minutes from that point onwards until we went on the stage and then the outcome was announced.
That's awesome. And can you speak a little bit about like what that moment was like for you? I mean, obviously it was a pretty intense competition going all the way from 450 applications to seven semifinalists and then all that work to get there and present your science. What did it feel like when you heard that you had won the challenge?
I have to say that I've just enjoyed the day so much that winning the challenge was just a cherry on top. I don't think that you can really go there, or personally, I don't think you should go there with this attitude of like you're going there to win the challenge. I think what you earn just by being there is so enormous that winning the challenge is just a cherry on top. I think because the nine teams, I believe it was nine who took part in the last stage of the challenge, they were all really amazing. And some of them, one of the people that I met there, they already had a primate study that was already completed at that stage, and they were very advanced. So I think you go there and you sometimes may think, well, people do different things, but it's not so easy to judge them. So I didn't go with this attitude of I have to win it, but just more to learn from everyone who is there, meet people, meet other companies in the field who you can also learn from. And yeah, it was just an amazing experience to have then been selected as the winner.
It's great. And I'm really excited to hear you sort of mention sort of value of the challenge being separate from the prize. I think that's a big theme that we hear year over year from, everyone that comes to the challenge, even those that don't win. And a lot of those folks continue to follow up with Lilly afterwards, get great engagement, and progress to do very interesting things together. So I guess like a question I would have for you is, could you talk a little bit about, what the, whatever you can say, what the sort of engagement with Lilly has been like after the challenge?
I would say it's been very intense. So the one most obvious way in which we have benefited is getting connected to Explore R&D, which is a branch of Lilly that supports external engagement with other companies. And in that capacity, they can engage with you based on your need. So in our case, we've had a number of meetings now with their regulatory teams because one of the challenges for us to bring this first-in-class approach towards a clinical trial is to outline a regulatory strategy in a field that's just so unexplored and so novel. And that has been absolutely amazing and something that is a huge added benefit to our preclinical strategy right now. But I have to say, we've had a number of additional engagements that some of them were quite spontaneous. So, for instance, a few months ago, the Lilly team came to Germany and they were doing like a fireside chat. And they just randomly invited me to share my experience, not of the challenge, but what do we do as a company and how does it feel to be building this in Europe. I've also had other interaction with Explore R&D when it comes to other ways in which they may want to consider advancing women's health in the future. So they were thinking, how can they actually enter Europe in a way that doesn't require building a biolabs in every major European city, which is out of what's possible at the moment. So that was also a very interesting discussion. And most recently, I also took part in a questionnaire of how that they were doing, thinking how one can advance fertility, women's space, and what can they be doing better. So I think it's been only a few months, but as you can hear, it has been multiple experiences on different fronts.
That's awesome. And maybe for those on the call, because Explore R&D is one of the business units at Lilly that always makes a big showing for this event. Can you just explain a little bit for folks like what Explore R&D is?
So it's a branch of Lilly that is designed to support external companies, and you can essentially do it without losing any IP rights, any equity, and they can do it in a very customized manner. So, for instance, you can have a consulting agreement with them where you just pay a fee for service. You can enter, of course, more complex arrangements depending on your need. But essentially, the way this works is you will interact with one of their engagement managers, and through this, they can help you explore what is your biggest unmet need, bring the absolute experts from Lilly to a meeting with you. And then usually it's actually a number of meetings because they try to fine tune your problem, see who is most relevant. And once this is set, then they can help you to address your particular question that you're struggling with and essentially brainstorm with you of how to tackle some of your challenges. This may be regulatory, but equally CMC, toxicology, or anything else to do with business development that you may be involved in. And actually, someone who's doing this with us at the moment is Alicia, whom I've also met through Nucleate, who used to be a Nucleate member. So it's a small world in the end.
It's awesome. I do have a couple more questions before we open it up, but this has been fantastic. Again, thank you for your time. I guess one question that I have, because we always get this, is can you talk a little bit about like the funding mechanism? I always say it time and time again, no strings attached, no IP rights, no right of first refusal, all of that good stuff. People typically still ask because they don't believe it. So just from you, in an unfiltered manner, can you talk a little bit about what that was like, and what restrictions, if any, apply to the funding?
Well, all I can say is that it's definitely true. So you do get an award, which is 100,000 US dollars, and there are no strings attached. So the agreement that you sign is incredibly simple comparing to most of the agreements you're going to encounter in your startup journey. It's very different, no strings attached, and it's really there to support you and to advance a particular part of your project that is a big unmet need. And perhaps just one thing that I would like to add here is when you are preparing your presentation, if you're invited, if you have a chance to present, I think it's always very useful to outline very specifically how you would like to spend this money, because of course it's more advantageous for people to see how this will advance your company if you have a precise idea instead of saying, "Oh, I want to collect more data," or "I want to establish this additional point in my toxicology safety."
Great. And that actually leads me into my next question, which was, and I know that, because you guys are international and it's actually Nucleate that transfers the funds. So we had a bit of a delay trying to figure out how we do that for the first time to an international company. But I guess if you have spent the money, what did you spend it on? And if you haven't spent it yet, what are your plans to use the money to advance your company?
So in our case, the plan was very clear. One of them is to achieve the first mouse born through our treated egg. So taking an egg that otherwise wouldn't be able to result in a healthy pregnancy and a mouse born and accomplishing this. And this is a huge milestone when it comes to cross-generational reprotoxicity, which was one of our incredibly important preclinical milestones. And the other part is to support our clinical development. And what I mean by that is now we work with clinics from 11 countries, spanning from South America to multiple countries in Europe. And actually obtaining this many patient samples is not an easy and cheap thing to do. And in our case, it's mainly actually transport because those samples have to be transported in liquid nitrogen. So shipping eggs from this many geographies is challenging. And this is essentially what we've been focusing on and what was also supported to some extent by the money. But I still have to say a big chunk of it is still in our bank account.
Awesome. Okay, I have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So obviously, women's health innovation is a space that has long been overlooked by industry, by the private sector, by the funding, and has lagged far behind many other spaces. I think we're starting to see, some glimmers of hope there, especially with folks like Lilly sort of diving in headfirst and trying to start new programs and mechanisms to support these types of companies and really making that a priority. Speaking as, a founder of a women-led women's innovation company, like what does it mean for you to have the support of someone like Lilly? And has that materially helped you or changed the nature of the fundraising conversations you've had or your strategy to build a business? Can you talk a little bit about what kind of signal that sends and how that has helped you on your journey?
I think support like this is absolutely huge. And what it gives people a stamp of approval. So if you ask me, it is a huge problem. Of course, half of the population is females. Not being able to conceive affects not only the female partner, but anyone else who is part of this family, this part of a network. But at the same time, of course, some people would still tell you, what's the market opportunity? Why do we need it? Who is going to pay for it? And then having this stamp of approval saying, well, Eli Lilly is very interested in this topic because clearly they run this challenge and they also thought that our solution is really worth focusing on. It helps tremendously to persuade the skeptics to at least speak to you. And then, of course, once you have this conversation, it's up to you to drive it and to persuade them that what you're doing is incredibly meaningful. When it comes to fundraising, we actually participate in the challenge just after raising our seed round. So we didn't have a need to go to the next fundraise, but I'm already pretty sure that's going to be very helpful from that perspective as well.
Awesome. And I guess maybe just one last thing. Sorry, I can't. This is always the
Mhm.
last question I like to ask. For folks that are on the call thinking about applying to the challenge, like, what would you say? What would you say to them?
Well, I would very strongly recommend that you do it. When it comes to the application, I think it's very important that you showcase your most promising, your most technologically advanced or surprising technology, because of course the competition is huge and you want to stand out. My second piece of advice would be actually regarding the poster session. I think the mistake that some people made was to focus too much on the scientific details and not outline the general picture. Because in the end, you're going to be again speaking to absolutely amazing people, but they may not have heard about your particular space, what other solutions are available. And I think having some coverage of this in your poster is very important to show to them why is your solution so attractive, how is it different, how is it going to revolutionize this disease area. And then the third piece of advice would be regarding the pitch, and I think I have mentioned this already, but to be very clear of where you are now and how the world will look like if your solution were to be successful, and how this non-dilutive grant is going to help you get to that stage.
Awesome. Thank you so much. With that, I think my pleasure to open it up to questions from the audience. Folks can put a question in the chat or can unmute and ask their question. I think just to start with one of the questions that I saw in the chat specifically from Rajat, you mentioned about in-depth scientific questions that were asked during the initial interview. Are those scientific questions related to the topic of the challenge, technology, approaches, or overall scientific acumen? Was there only one interview session before the selection happened? So I guess maybe to speak a little bit about first the interview, which is conducted by the Nucleate team, and then also what it was like, what kind of questions you were asked at the poster session.
Mhm. So in our case, the original interview was just with a single member of the Nucleate team. But I have to say she was incredibly well prepared. She read our deck, but she must have done also some reading around the topic. And the questions were very much focused on our technology and how does it fit into the journal space. So I would not say that these were questions more broadly about the challenge women's health. It was very much about where we are as a company, what is our science, how does it make us different, but also very much details on the data that supports our technology.
Awesome. I shot off a few answers to some of the more general questions in the chat, but if anyone has a specific question for Agata, please feel free to unmute or ask it in the chat.
Yeah, I have put it in the chat. But thank you very much for talking to us today. I am very early stage, and I would love your opinion, like honest opinion as to what stage you were at when you applied and maybe kind of the pros and cons of that.
So I have to say that we were at a very different stage to where we are right now. And actually, I very quickly looked at our application back then, and it's really quite amazing how things change very rapidly in the startup world. But we must have applied for the challenge, I believe, around June, July last year. And this was just 5 months after having incorporated our company. So we've done our incorporation in January 2026. And I have to say that our scientific foundations are very solid and they really build on more than a decade of research in those human samples. But at the same time, as a company, we were incredibly young. I remember when I went for the challenge, I only had one scientist working with me. And when I came back from Indianapolis, the first thing I did is I came back to the lab for like a 10-hour day because we got some human eggs that were delivered that day. So we're incredibly small, a team of just 3 people. just having incorporated and being in the very, very initial stages of our journey. So I wouldn't get discouraged as long as you have something to really showcase why what you do is so special and so unique.
Thank you.
Great question. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to throw out?
Thanks for taking time to answer questions. I'm wondering how you went around raising your seed funding. I realize that's a little different from the Lilly Challenge.
Sorry, I understood the questions about seed funding, but what specifically?
I'm just curious how you chose who you would actually seek funding from, and how you went about actually talking to them.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, as I've mentioned, we are a team of three co-founders. Two of us are extremely scientific, so myself and Melina Shu, and then our third co-founder, Sasha Jagielski, has business background, and we've approached this together. We were very lucky, despite the quite horrible financing landscape at that stage, that we had an oversubscribed round with a couple of term sheets. But the decision that we made in the end is number one, of course, valuation. I mean, that matters a lot. But what is also incredibly important is the small print conditions in your term sheet. So what kind of control do you have of your company? How is the funding going to be transferred? Are there any tranching stages and so on? And I think what's also incredibly important when you start building something in those early days is to actually choose VCs that you get on with very well at the personal level, who believe in you and why what you're doing is so important. Um, because at later stages, there are many other things that come into play. So, for instance, what is their experience in your particular field, how well connected they are to help you advance some of the aspects of your company building. But I think in the very beginning is finding the most supportive people who really want you to succeed, transition to Series A on good terms, but who still believe that it's you who should be in the leading role and who are also reasonable when it comes to the terms they're offering.
Fantastic. And just a note on that, I put a nice resource in the chat for anyone that's navigating early stage fundraising. There's this great book called Venture Deals. They've released multiple editions of it, but it will go in extreme depth around all of the fine print stuff that was mentioned there that you should pay attention to in your term sheet. So a great resource for anyone that's looking to raise money.
I read that book as well, so definitely would recommend.
Yeah, it's like canon for all founders out there, especially for doing pre-seed early stage raises. So one question that was asked is what makes an application competitive, especially for early stage projects? And then for Agata, what made the Ovo project competitive across the stages of the application? Maybe I can just very briefly talk about the first part and then pass it off to you to add some color. So I think a couple of things that make applications competitive. One is that it has to fit within the tracks, right? So, women's health, fertility, extending the window, rejuvenation of eggs, perfect fit, right? I think is one example. The second thing that makes applications really competitive across this challenge is just having top tier groundbreaking science. When you look at, the work that was done to get to the point of where Ovo Labs is now, that was work that was done over decades, resulting in multiple high profile publications. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the first video, right, of a human egg cell undergoing meiosis. And that type of basic research enabling the translational aspect of the project is something that will really help set you apart and really is what Lilly's looking for. I think the third aspect is having an element of how the project could be translated. So having some sense as to how to pitch it as a business, even if it's still a research project, having a clear translational path to the clinic conceptualized and being able to verbalize that, I think is really important. The other aspect, the fourth thing would be how you use of funds. So, as mentioned, really important, I think, to include in your application how the funds are going to be used and how it could be transformational for your company or for your research. And then the last thing I think is team. It's really hard to be a founder. You have to be very resilient. You have to be very wily. You have to be very smart and, know people and sort of, be able to learn things very, very quickly. So I think, the people that we select, are also looking for extremely strong founding teams and people that, know how to navigate answering difficult questions under pressure. So those would be like just a couple of things I would throw out there, and then happy to pass it off if you have anything you'd like to add.
I fully agree with what you said, Oliver. I mean, in the end, Lilly Nucleate, they're interested in real science and something that has really the potential to transform the field. So I think that's the most important aspect. I think when it comes to stand out later in the application, what's important is to try to be memorable in one way or another. And clearly, I know that we've managed to achieve this because Oliver just mentioned a video that I was showing during my pitch. So it was, of course, a very quick one. But what we've done as a team before founding the company in Melina's lab is we recorded the first ever video of a human egg segregating its chromosomes as it undergoes through meiosis. And I think seeing something like this means that, of course, it's easy to visualize what you're doing and why is it so special. So I think trying to achieve that is definitely a plus. And then one small point on addressing difficult questions. I remember one of the questions that I was asked during the pitch was about a competitive company. And this, of course, you would answer these questions multiple times when speaking to investors, but it's very different doing it on stage where it's still, of course, people that you greatly value who are doing amazing things, but they are very different to what you're doing. And trying to address this in a way that still reflects your genuine opinion, but also that is balanced and very reasonable is also important. And I think that's something that matters as well a lot when it comes to how your pitch is being perceived.
Definitely. Couple of questions coming up around IP confidentiality, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll take Gabriel's question first. Can you share how IP and confidential information are typically handled throughout the challenge, particularly during application and finalists, and whether there are any safeguards in place when interacting with Eli and Lilly and company's scientific teams? So just from my perspective, and then feel free to add color there. This challenge, you must submit non-confidential materials. If you submit materials that are labeled confidential, they'll be discarded and you won't be considered for the challenge. There's no NDA in place. There is basically no protection beyond what you choose to put in your deck and communicate. There are many ways to communicate your science, even if it's pre-publication or pre-IP disclosure, in a way that is non-confidential. This does not threaten the patentability of such research. And there's all sorts of great resources online for how to do that. One example is just blinding your data, right? If you're targeting a specific gene in some process, right, you can show the outcome of your functional assay and call it gene X. Now it's non-confidential. That's not going to threaten your patentability because you haven't disclosed the actual gene of interest that you're looking at. So that's just one example. And in terms of how things are treated, once the material is submitted, it is open for review by obviously the Nucleate reviewers as well as Lilly. So that is why we require it to be non-confidential. So it will be reviewed by a small team internally at Nucleate, probably about 5 or 6 people this year, before being down selected. And then eventually it will be reviewed by a small team of reviewers on Lilly's side, which will be about 5 or 6 people this year. And then when you get to the challenge, again, everything's non-confidential, right? So when you're asked questions about your research, you need to be able to sort of answer them in a way that protects the confidentiality of your work. And that is, in many ways, a fantastic skill set that all founders need to really master in order to start companies, because no investor is going to sign an NDA on the first meeting. So if you can't pitch your technology in a non-confidential way that gets an investor or a partner excited to have a second meeting, then you're never going to get to the point where you've raised funds or you've got a partnership with someone. But yeah, feel free to add any color to that, Agata, if you have.
Absolutely. I think as a founder, you have to continuously speak to people, most of whom would have not signed an NDA with you. And it's an absolute skill to be able to actually convey why what you're doing is so incredible. What is the strength of your data without disclosing too much detail? So, for instance, in our case, what we always focus on, and that's also what we did when we applied for the challenge, is what problem are we solving? What are the readouts that we're using to show that we're really improving equality? And what is our data? Now, it doesn't really matter what protein or like what actual biologic you're using to achieve this question. What really matters is the effect size and what kind of pathways you're addressing. So I wouldn't be paranoid. I really don't think that Lily or anyone else is there to like steal your data. Of course, be reasonable, be mindful of the fact that many people will see the results, but don't disclose anything too confidential. Present your data in a way that's still incredibly exciting. And if you then decide to engage with Lily later on, for instance, with Explore R&D, then they would be very happy to sign a CDA, NDA with you and actually discuss the confidential information. But this is more down the line.
Fantastic. Um, I guess, are there any other? I think I've answered all of the questions in the chat that are directly relevant to Agata. Are there any other questions for Agata from anyone on the chat or in the call?
Sorry, I just posted a question. How technical should the application be? Are there folks who are evaluating us, scientists, or should the application be more generalized, colloquial?
Yeah, so the applications should certainly, this is like one of the things that I see founders make mistakes on all the time. They submit something that's like so vague that like you don't know what data they even have. And again, there are ways to present non-confidential data in a format that is acceptable. The absolute minimum format would be to just say on a slide, we have done XYZ proof of concept and XYZ models without even showing the data. Sometimes people don't even put that in the application. And then when we're reviewing it, it's like, well, we have 450 applications. I'm not going to email this person and ask them what data they have if they didn't even put it in the deck, right? So I would highly suggest that people take a data-driven approach. Doesn't mean the whole slide deck has to be data focused. It should be a good balance, right? But you need to be showing some reason to believe, right, that the thing that you're doing is real and is exciting, and there would be, an opportunity to engage on that. And again, when you look at the people that have won the challenge in the past and the teams that are selected to attend, groundbreaking science is, one of the top things that Lilly and Nucleate is really looking for out of this competition.
Thank you.
Yep. And then a question about eligible to apply for in women's health diagnostic fields. No, because women's health is not a track this year for this challenge. That was last year. But diagnostic companies can, in fact, apply as well as medical device companies. Historically, Lilly's been more interested in therapeutics. However, their interests change all the time. Can be hard to nail it down. So, for example, when you think about one of this year's subtracks in particular, mobility and frailty, right? That is an area where there might be more appetite for a medical device than in previous grand challenges. So that's sort of if you're not in it, you can't win it. I would encourage that anyone who thinks they're eligible should in fact apply. But to be honest, typically they're looking more at therapeutic companies or things that create data that identify targets that could create therapeutics, right? So AI focused target identification in any of these tracks also totally valid and of interest. So I'll loop back to the questions relating to like that I am positioned to answer relating about like this year's challenge. Just want to make sure we're respectful of Agata's time. Does anyone else have any questions directly for her? And if not, we can give her some time back in our calendar, and I'm happy to stick around till the top of the hour to continue answering questions.
Hey, yeah, I have a question, and thanks for your time. For these types of non-dilutive opportunities or like program solicitations, whatever, there are a lot of tempting opportunities to apply because you can apply your technology to that solicitation, but it ends up becoming a distraction if like because now you have to meet the requirements of that program, right? So I'm curious, you know, was this something that you just had complete free reign to do exactly what you were going to do already anyway, or did you need to tailor something a little bit more specifically to Lilly to meet the Grand Challenge objectives, or how did you navigate that?
So in our case, what we proposed there was exactly what we planned to do. We didn't tailor it based on what we thought Lily wants to see, but we just came in there. So I presented our truthful mission and vision and our upcoming milestones. And I think it's important. I would strongly suggest that one does it. I know what you mean with the distractions. So I've of course also taken part in certain things that I could label as a distraction, but in all honesty, this particular opportunity was anything but that. And as I've already mentioned, like the preparation for the challenge was very helpful. The interaction on site and all the other small things that come out of it that you may not even be thinking about now. So, for instance, even though I didn't meet this person on the day, someone from Nucleate team said, "Oh, by the way, I'm interesting. I'm help connecting companies to VCs." And Yofi has now been in touch with me multiple times. Whenever he hears of something interesting in women's health space, he gets in touch with me and suggests certain things. So I think I wouldn't call it a distraction. We haven't tailored anything. And if anything, I would actually think it's quite difficult to tailor it to what Lily wants, because usually the challenge is in a domain where they're actually at present not so active in. So I would just present what you're actually planning to do.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you.
Great answer. Are there any other questions? All right. If not, I just want to say a huge thank you. And again, congratulations, Agata, for all the incredible work that you're doing with Ovo Labs and continue to do now and in the future. And thank you again for coming back to share your advice and answer some questions from our audience. So thank you so much, and we can give you some time back on your calendar.
Absolutely. It's been a real pleasure. And I'll just finish with one last piece of advice. If you're accepted to a challenge and you have an opportunity to do a pitch session with someone from Nucleate team, in my case, it was Oliver, I would very strongly recommend that you do it because, of course, he's participated in the challenge. He organized it multiple times and he knows what to look out for. It also gives you like a lot of confidence that someone who knows what to expect is happy with the way that you've structured your presentation. So don't miss out on that opportunity because I think some people didn't necessarily do it and then they were a bit surprised why was something else expected of them than what they've anticipated. So that's my last golden piece of advice. And otherwise, it's been a real pleasure seeing you. And yeah, good luck.